Without further delay, I would like to introduce Professor Abhijit Sen, who would be chairing today's session. Professor Sen is Member Planning Commission with the Government of India. He has earlier held teaching posts at the Universities of Sussex, Oxford and Cambridge, and is currently on the executive committees of University of Delhi, IIT Delhi, and the National Centre for Agricultural Policy. Professor Sen, if I could request you.
Okay, welcome everybody. I suppose my first task is to introduce the speaker. Anyone who knows this basic area would have at least heard the name Angus Deaton. Angus is a professor of economics and international affairs, that I do know, at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Angus is, of course, well known to anyone who is an economist for his work in consumer economics. I mean, how people behave. I think that, I suppose, is the general area. But he's chosen this time to talk on evaluation. And I think a lot of his talk will be around the practice and assumptions regarding evaluation, and without actually trying to guess what he's going to talk about, I think it's just simply let it go on.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here again after too long a delay. I think I'm going to go and stand at the that's all right. So I'm going to talk about evaluations. Everybody's interested in evaluations, and more generally about evidence for policy. I think it's pretty much no one disagrees that it's a good idea to use evidence when designing policies. But once you get beyond that basic agreement, there are all sorts of views about what sort of evidence you should use, how you should obtain it, whether some kinds of evidence are better than other kinds of evidence. And much of what I'll talk about is what is sometimes referred to as a hierarchy of evidence, in that there's some types of evidence which should be given privileges over other types of evidence, that they're better, they're more credible. And in particular, I will talk quite a lot about randomized controlled trials. I'm going to explain in some detail how randomized controlled trials work. For those of you who don't think about this every day, like I do, I will comment on this at the sort of ground level. But a phrase that you often hear is that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. That's a term that really comes from medicine, where randomized controlled trials are used very heavily, but they're becoming very heavily used in development economics too. want to talk also about how we move from the evidence to the policy. So you regard this as really two steps. One is you develop the evidence, you go out into the village and you see what happens if you implement some policy, and then you've got an answer. And then you have to come back to Delhi or go to the block headquarters or whatever, and you have to try to explain to people what they should do differently based on the evidence that you've gathered. And what's very important to realize is that these two steps, which are conceptually separate, the gathering of evidence and the using of evidence, the whole policy-based, evidence-based policy depends on both of those steps. And your evidence-based policy will be just as strong as the weakest of those two links. So if you have super good evidence, it's no good at all if you can't translate it into policy. So that step has to be thought about really very hard too. And a lot of this talk will be about that step. I'm going to use some running examples which are sort of selected for Indian relevance. And I'll just scatter these around as I go. One is about building dams. Does the construction of dams lead to poverty reduction, or does it lead to poverty increase? And are building dams a good idea? Another one is sanitation. We have a student at Princeton who's spending most of his time in India working on the total sanitation campaign and its effects on child mortality and child health. How should such schemes be implemented? Do the ones we have actually work, and what do we learn from them? Microfinance is a perpetually fashionable topic. Is microfinance an effective tool for poverty reduction? And there's lots of evidence being developed around that. Food subsidies, I'm thinking here of the PDS versus cashing out the PDS, cash or food. Conditional cash transfers, how do we develop evidence for that? And in general, I'm interested in evaluating this phrase. Every time I put something in quotes, it means you shouldn't really take it literally. So this term, finding out what works, which is sort of one of my bet noirs, I'll try to explain that. And the statements that you often hear are things like rigorous evaluation of conditional cash transfers has shown that they work. And that statement is sort of, and therefore that leads to everybody should have conditional cash transfers. Well, what does that statement mean? Does it have any value? Is it true? Does it mean anything for India? Does it mean anything for anyone? All right, let me develop a little bit of background. And this, I'm not sure how relevant this is, so I'll go through this quickly. There's a general feeling over recent years that the whole of development economics and the whole development project has been something of a failure. That it hasn't really done very well. If you look at the bottom of this thing, for many years people would argue that there'd been little or no progress. And I think people don't really argue that to the same extent now, though it does remain very unclear whether the development effort by rich countries, by the World Bank, by other international organizations, has really been positive or negative. I mean, I'm thinking of the fact that there's been a lot of poverty reduction in the world. There's been poverty reduction in India. The question is whether it was economic development or the development project that did that, or whether it would have just happened by itself. One of the things that people like to point to was the cycling fashions of the World Bank. I've listed some of them there. The bank sort of started out working on infrastructure. It's gone through a whole bunch of other things, including structural adjustment, education, health, gender, political economy, governance, and now it seems to have gone back to infrastructure again. I don't really want to single out the World Bank, but the development community as a whole, or at least what I think of as the community of developers. And a lot of the criticism here has been that this process has been heavily influenced by fashion, by politics, especially in the rich world, but heavily unconstrained. I don't know if you can be heavily unconstrained. Very unconstrained by evidence, and that evidence has played really very little part in the cycling of fashions over time. Now, there are many possible stories for this state of affairs, but one story is that there's been a failure to learn from experience. So this brings me back to my evidence-based policy. That there's been no systematic, rigorous, notice the quotes around rigorous. Rigorous is now also one of my pet